with his wife, and they took me to their beautiful home, and we talked many things, and they're the ones who hosted me at MSU up to the provost's office. David is a warm person, and just to leak today's star, we are trying to interest him, to coax him, to caress him, and the wife, that they come here on a Fulbright fellowship starting May next year. So he's a very special person to us. He received a joint PhD in psychology and speech communication at Indiana University in 1990. And after completing his PhD, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Cognitive Sciences program at Vanderbilt University. He has held faculty positions at the University of Alabama and Ohio State, and is currently a professor of media and information at MSU. And he got a very special recognition, was named a fellow of the International Communication Association in 2016. David's research focuses primarily on media psychology, with specific emphasis on racism, video games, entertainment, attitudes, and decision-making. He has published extensively in the leading journals in communication and psychology. He is a founder co-editor of the Journal of Media Psychology, founding editor of the Journal of Communication Methods and Measures, and edited the Annals of the International Communication Association. He has also co-edited 3 books, Communication and Emotion, Communication and Social Cognition, Theories and Methods, and the Handbook of Communication Science, and recently co-authored Communication Science Theory and Research, an advanced introduction. And he was one of the 4 editors of the International Encyclopedia of Media Psychology. And so, David, I want to welcome you at a distance, and I want you to feel at home. And we are all very anxious to listen to you. And please pass my best regards to your family. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, VC. That's a very nice welcome. It was a pleasure to be here today. It was a big honor to be here today. Thank you for that nice introduction. I do have to admit there is some sadness today because I'm not there in Daystar. I was in Daystar in 2016 for the first International Communication Association African Conference. But I am wearing my Daystar hat that the VC gave me when he was visiting in Michigan, a prized treasure of mine. So thank you so much. When I was in Daystar, one of the things that impressed me, and then a year later when we were in Entebbe working with students and faculty, young faculty, was the quality of the ideas. It just blew me away. And as the VC noted, I've edited a number of journals, and there are a number of authors whose manuscripts I've rejected who will be more than happy to say, I don't say that very easily. But the ideas are very, very theoretically innovative and very intriguing. And so with those great ideas, it's important that you do research that fits within the guidelines for what it means to be a scientist. Now I'm going to start today with a, as soon as I can get my pen, just a second, give me a second there. A metaphor that I like to use, which is research as a conversation. And this is, I tend to start several of my talks that I've given at Daystar with this picture. This is a picture of Sister Landau and my partner and wife, Nancy Rose, the VC was mentioning. But I want to contextualize what I'm going to be talking about today. And to me, it's important to understand that research is a conversation. We tend to think about research is this thing that we go and do, but it's something that we're always involved with when you're a scientist. when we're involved with conversation, there are many different voices involved in that conversation, and hopefully yours is a voice that is a part of that conversation because you have valuable things to contribute to that conversation. And I believe that very strongly. Also, as in a conversation, doing science is a process of learning where we're constantly innovating and updating our ideas. And it's an ongoing process. No one ever has the final word in a scientific program of research. It's always going on. You know, for example, in my area, Leon Festinger proposed a classic theory, dissidence theory, back in the 1950s. 70 years later, we are still refining and updating that theory. Because while Festinger was brilliant, ideas develop across time. And to be effective in a conversation, you have to be coherent. You can't exaggerate, you can't understate, you need to be honest. You need to know what point you want to make, and you have to stay on task. And I have that on the slide just to try to remind me to stay on task today too. So I'll try to do that. I also think it's incredibly important when you're involved in the research process to experience the joy, just the sheer excitement when your research works, when you've posed that research question or that hypothesis that everyone else looks at you and rolls their eyes and says, that will never work. And then you do the experiment and it works. Experience that joy and celebrate that joy. But, and this will be the crux of the talk today, if you are going to be a part of this conversation, it is important to experience that joy, but it's equally important or more important to be ethical as you're doing the research. So what I want to talk about today are going to be three things. I want to talk about examples of unethical research, some of which the BC has already mentioned. I'll expand on some of those a little bit. And at the same time, I'll be talking about how research ethics has been addressed across the time, and I'll be going back and forth across these two to show, as in a conversation, our understanding of research ethics and how we address issues of research ethics has also progressed across time. It's not static, it is a dynamic process. And then I want to close today's talk by talking about why this matters, because again, to me, it's so critical that as scholars, you be ethical because we need to hear your voice. And that's part of the reason why it matters, but there are going to be other reasons as well. So earlier approaches to considering research ethics actually go back a very long time. I mean, we oftentimes will start with the Tuskegee experiments, and I'll talk about those in a minute, and then the horrific research that was done during World War II. But earlier approaches to research ethics were based on reflection. And for example, Francis Bacon, the noted philosopher, in a book he published, a treatise he published in 1620, argued, you know, it's an ethical obligation of scientists or for research is that it be for the benefit of people, that research should always be aimed at bettering everything we can for people. Charles Babbage, in writing in 1830, he was a British scientist. And he wrote a book, Reflections on the Decline of Science in England and Some of Its Causes. And he made the same point I'm going to try to close with today. Now, he was arguing that science in England at that time, and at this point in the 1800s, the 19th century, England, London in particular, was the center of the great scientific research that was going on in the world. And he argued that the decline that was going on at that point was because of unethical practices on the part of British scientists. So we can see going back for a long time this concern about ethics and the quality of science that we're doing. Claude Bernard was a medical researcher and a doctor. And at that point, when scientists would do medical research and doctors would do medical research, unfortunately, in my view, a lot of the research was done on vulnerable populations. And that was for various reasons. And he said, no, that's not acceptable. He was going to set up some of the early real clear standards by which we make judgments about the merits of scientific research. And he argued that if I'm going to do research with a vulnerable population, and I may do that, but first, is this something I would be willing to do to myself? If I'm not willing to do whatever it is the procedure is to myself, then I have an obligation not to perform it on anybody else either. And so he started setting up very strict criteria for standards for what was scientific or not. And another big breakthrough was what at the Walter Reed Hospital in the United States when they were studying yellow fever in 1900. And this was one of the first times where informed consent, so participants clearly understood what they were being involved with, that was used. And this was something, again, they came up upon with their own reflection. And the other way early on that scientific research ethics were promoted and enforced was through court cases. So if I was a scientist and I did something unethical, I could be sued, I could be charged with a crime. But the problem with both of these is that they're sort of loose. They don't give us a lot of real clear criteria, and they leave a lot of space for violations to happen. And that's what we saw happen. In the Tuskegee experiments, which the VC has already mentioned, I'm going to start by talking about that. And these are studies that are very dear to me because growing up, my hero was George Washington Carver. I read everything I could get my hands on about George Washington Carver. And he's still one of my heroes I really hold up. And he taught at the Tuskegee Institute, which is a university in Tuskegee, Alabama. So it's a small town in Alabama. And the Tuskegee experiments had nothing to do with Tuskegee Institute, but they have colored the impression of Tuskegee Institute, which has always hurt me a lot because of George Washington Carver's association with that. And I want to say, with all of the examples we're going to be giving, it's not that these are mad scientists. A lot of the work that we're talking about, where we talk about really unethical research practices, really goes back to this notion of banality of evil. That these aren't, your stereotypical evil scientists. These are people who are doing research that they think is necessary to do, but they didn't use appropriate criteria in making those judgments. So the Tuskegee experiment was actually conducted by a branch of the US government. The United States Public Health Services were the people who conducted this study. And what they were interested in is what's the natural course of untreated syphilis. So how does syphilis develop across the lifespan of an individual human? And at that time, heavy metals were used in the treatment of syphilis. But what they did is they wanted to see what happens when people are not treated. And so they recruited young Black men in Tuskegee. And the recruitment was that there's going to be a special free treatment for what they called bad blood. So none of the men were told that they had syphilis. They were told they had bad blood, whatever that meant. And so there was no notion of informed consent. And in fact, they were lied to when they were recruited, both through omission, not telling them that they had syphilis, and then through deception and telling them that they were going to get new special treatments. And that was not the case. And so this started in 1932 when they recruited these 400 individuals. In the 1940s, we knew then that penicillin was a very effective treatment for syphilis. But penicillin was withheld from these individuals. And so they were, again, not treated because the US Public Health Services wanted to study the process of how syphilis develops across time. Even in the 1950s, when penicillin became a widely available treatment, so a common treatment for syphilis, it was withheld from these individuals. And because these individuals had not been told they had syphilis, they didn't know that that was something that would help them with the disease. So we've now gone 20 years where there were, or more, where there were effective treatments available for these men and no treatment was offered to them. The other thing I want to note is that every couple of years, a report was filed on the basis of this research with the federal government. So it wasn't like this was being done and hidden someplace. It was ongoing research, and they thought it was important to understand what was going on with syphilis. In my view, it does not begin to justify what they did. And in fact, in 1969, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control in the United States, did an extensive review of the studies and said, yeah, let's go ahead and keep going with this. And it wasn't until 1972 when the popular press got a hold of this and started talking about the Tuskegee experiments that they were stopped. And so this is 40 years after the studies began, these men were allowed to have syphilis ravaging their body. And later, President Clinton apologized for this, but it was just such a shocking, horrific example of where science had gone amiss. This is not what we want science to be doing. And so this was one early example that really shocked people. These are some of the survivors of Tuskegee experiments. We don't know how many men died early, prematurely, because they were not treated for syphilis, because the record keeping was so horrendous. We know for certain 8 men died, but estimates are as high as over 100 men died prematurely because treatment was withheld from them. And like I said, the public was horrified, as they should have been, about this. World War II, then, as the VC noted, is when we really start. Also, a lot of really horrific research was done. And Nazi scientists conducted experiments with concentration camp prisoners. And these experiments ranged from all types of things, from what are known as the boot studies, where men and women were required to march up to 48 kilometers a day to study how effective these boots were, how good they were, what happens when people suffer injuries, what are ways to treat it, and things like that, to studies of atmospheric pressure for pilots, so they could understand what was going to happen to pilots who were fighting for Germany, for the Nazis at that point, to the hypothermia experiments, which are also some very notorious experiments where prisoners were dunked in cold water, in freezing cold water, to see how their body responded to it. And many prisoners were killed and died of hypothermia through this. And again, the idea that was guiding the research is, well, we want to help German soldiers who are fighting for the Nazis. And so we want to know how to treat them when they're shot down over the ocean or what have you. But it was, it was very horrific research. And this is a slide on the number of studies that were conducted in the camps on prisoners. And at one level, it doesn't look like, oh, it's not a whole lot of experiments. At the height, there were 59 experiments started in 1943. But the other thing I would note is that once the study started, for example, the boot studies that we mentioned, which resulted in a lot of pain to people. Because imagine marching, being forced to march about, like I said, up to 48 kilometers every day, with oftentimes inadequate footwear and so forth, to study what happens when soldiers are marching all over the place. When that study started, it went on for a decade, and it was counted as one study. So we're talking about thousands of people here that were tortured, essentially in the name of science. Eva Kor is a person who became very outspoken about this. She was one of the victims of the twin studies. This is a picture of her at Auschwitz right before she passed away when she was 85 years old, but very eloquent, spoke out about the horrors of being, she was a participant. She was one of the subjects in Mengele's twin studies and the horrible things that he did, tortured people. But the Germans weren't the only ones that were doing horrific research during the war. Japanese scientists began conducting experiments on Chinese POWs and Korean prisoners and civilians. We know of as early as 1932 with Chinese, and probably earlier with Koreans, because they'd occupied Korea since the 19-teens. And a lot of this research was aimed about better understanding warfare. In this instance, a lot of the research focused on biological weapons and chemical weapons and understanding their effects and what are good biological weapons. Again, doing really horrific research on prisoners and prisoners of war and civilians in the case of Koreans. One of the things that I find really raises some really huge ethical questions. When I was involved in a research seminar as a graduate student at Indiana University, this is an area that we had a lot of, I would like to call it discussion, but it was out and out argument and disagreement. But the US did not prosecute the Japanese who were involved in this research in exchange for the data. So the US officials essentially said, we'll let you get away with this if you let us have the data so we can understand these chemical and biological weapons. Same debates occurred in relationship to the hypothermia experiments that the Germans conducted. The notion was, well, why don't we take this data and learn what we can in terms of treating people who are victims of hypothermia? My own reaction to that was to be horrified, and that's why I said some of these debates got very intense when I was a graduate student, because my view is I mean, I'll be honest, I don't know the correct answer. There is that knowledge. On the other hand, this knowledge was gained through such horrific processes that perhaps we have an obligation to find other ways to demonstrate that the information could have been gathered. But this is one of those ethical questions that arise from this. And even in the United States, we were doing what I would consider, and the VC pointed at this research as well. You know, the Manhattan Project, which was the project that was involved with the development of the atomic bomb that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The Manhattan Project started in the early 40s. It actually started at Iowa State University, where I was an undergraduate student. I wasn't an undergraduate student then, though. I'm not quite that old, but in the early 40s. But this involved a scientist being exposed to a lot of radiation. Much higher levels of radiation than was normal, and people didn't know what effect that was. And so the US government, the military, started doing experiments on radiation, and radiation would be injected into people to see, or they would drink it to see what would happen to them. And these experiments went on for a long time. This is one of the research facilities. I believe it was in one of the Carolinas, but I could be wrong on that. But this was one of the research facilities where they did the radiation experiments. So during the war, a lot of very unethical research was done. And the justification for this research was that, well, we have emergency situations. And so we are allowed to do this more research that might be questionable. I mean, that's, for example, with the radiation studies, that was the defense that was given for it. And I think we need to pay attention to that, because we see similar things going on right now with the pandemic, the global pandemic, where you have some scientists say the standards need to be lower in terms of what's ethical or unethical. And I would say, no, that's not the case. The standards still need to be very high. And I will return to why I think the ethical standards in emergency situations, where it becomes very easy for people to say, this is a global pandemic, this is a global emergency, we need to loosen the ethical standards, why ultimately that undermines the entire process. But we will return to that in a minute. The responses to the things that happened in World War II there were a number of international conventions that were drawn up. The Nuremberg Code was a result of the trial of over 20 Nazi doctors who were involved with research in the camps. And this resulted in the Nuremberg Code in 1947. And since it focused on the doctors, obviously it's going to focus on medical research. So this was focusing specifically on biomedical ethics. But again, what had been stressed earlier was the notion that people needed to have consent. They needed to have autonomy, and we'll return to this again in a second. That research should minimize risk to the research participants, and you had to weigh benefits versus harm. That these were three important things that were going to guide making decisions on what is ethical or unethical research. And that was the Nuremberg Code coming out in 1947. The Geneva Conventions in 1949 further reiterated these conventions, these criteria, but they were focusing specifically in the context of warfare, so that it was for the protection of prisoners, it was for protection of civilians, so we didn't have the horrors that we had from during World War II across the board, really, going on again. So this was focused on specifically in the context of warfare. And then the Helsinki Declaration in 1964 was a further elaboration of the Nuremberg Codes, again, that focused specifically on medical research. And so a lot was done at the international level to try to address research ethics, but it's still, unethical research still continued. And I apologize that many of my examples are from the United States, but that's where I live, and those are the examples I'm used to, and it's where a lot of the unethical research happened. Willowbrook State School hepatitis studies are just horrible studies that were done in the United States. Willowbrook State School was a school for children with intellectual disabilities. So these are kids who are generally, we would say, are mentally retarded or have intellectual disabilities. And the scientists deliberately gave them hepatitis, injected them with hepatitis, much like the Tuskegee experiments, because they wanted to see how hepatitis develops, and they also wanted to study ways to combat hepatitis. When this was discovered, of course, there was an outrage because these are special vulnerable populations. And the scientists' defense still just baffles me. Their basic defense was, well, these kids almost certainly were going to get hepatitis anyway. So, what's the big deal that we gave it to them versus they got it through, natural contact? And there was a lot of hepatitis cases naturally at these schools because you had a lot of adolescents, a lot of kids in very close contact with each other at these schools, and the sanitary conditions were not always what you would want. But the notion that they were going to get this anyway, so that makes it okay for us to give them hepatitis, is always, I found very disturbing as a defense. At the same time, the CIA was doing mind control experiments through the 1950s and 60s, again in the notion of national defense, and during the height of the Cold War dangers, fears of the Cold War. And a lot of these studies, again, would involve giving mind-altering drugs in very high doses to people to see, how does this affect them? Can we get more information from them if we give them really high doses of LSD and they hallucinate? And again, by any standards, pretty unethical research. The next two studies are going to be ones that strike home to me because these were both done by social psychologists, and my training is in social and cognitive psychology. And these were ones that caught a lot of attention in the United States and led to, I believe, played a critical role, along with the Tuskegee and the Willowbrook studies, in what we're going to see ultimately going on. And the first is the Milgram obedience studies that started in 1961. And after World War II, and the horrific crimes that were committed in that war, social psychologists in the United States wanted to understand obedience and why would people obey orders to do really unethical things. And this came out of a case study of Eichmann, which the title of the book for this was The Banality of Evil, that Eichmann was not an evil person. He was just following orders. And he was a very efficient bureaucrat, which is why he was able to put together essentially the underlying program for the destruction of 12 million people, and a conservative estimate of 12 million victims of the camps. But he was involved with moving people around from the camps and where people were killed and things like that. And in a case study of him, the conclusion was, he's not what you would think about as this horrible, evil person that we see in movies. He was just an ordinary person who obeyed orders. And so there was a lot of interest in this. And so Milgram wanted to study that. And in Milgram's studies, if you were the participant, you thought there were actually two participants there, and you were told it was a study of learning. The second participant was actually a Confederate. And you were going to be the teacher. So you thought you were randomly assigned to be a teacher in a rigged drawing, and the other person was the learner. And you were told you're going to read them lists of words, and they would give the words back to you. And every time that they made a mistake, you would shock them. And every time they made a mistake, the intensity of the shock would go up by 15 volts. And the panel that they're using to increase the intensity of the shocks, when you've seen it, it's really pretty scary. I probably should have had a slide of it, because at one point it gets up to like it has a triple X, and it, this panel to me alone causes like, ooh, I mean, it just looks really intimidating. As this is all being explained to the subject, the Confederate says, oh, I have a heart condition. And the experimenter says, oh, no worry, no permanent damage will happen from this. You'll be fine. And then they start the study. And, early on when they're shocked, you get these grunts because they're low-level shocks and stuff like that. And it gets more and more intense. And so that the Confederate starts screaming and starts complaining about his heart, and ultimately says, I will not continue. I won't participate anymore. And oftentimes at this point, the participants would look over the experimenter, and the experimenter would say, you must continue. And that's it. I mean, what the experimenter said to people was pretty straightforward, and it was nothing like, I'm going to break your arm if you don't continue shocking this person. It was just, you must continue. And they had a script of 4 prompts that they would give back. Many of the participants actually thought they had killed the Confederate, because at one point he stops and there's no more sound. Here's a picture of one of the participants, and you can see the mental distress that these people are going through. And there were a large number of studies done on trying to understand different facets of obedience using this procedure, which was very psychologically tormenting to research participants. And the other classic study that got a lot of media at this time was the Stanford's prisoner study. And this was done, as you might guess, at Stanford University. Zimbardo was the person who did it. And again, he was more interested in the othering that happens when we have prisoners, and so how we can treat prisoners so horribly. And so college students came in, they were told that you're going to be here for 2 weeks, so pack accordingly, bring the stuff that you need to stay there for 2 weeks. And then they were randomly assigned to be either a guard or a prisoner, and then they were let go to do what they wanted. And very quickly you saw the prisoners taking a lot of power and being very disparaging to the guards, taking this power and being very disparaging to the prisoners. And it became really horrible. Here's a picture from the study where you see, for example, the two guards have the prisoners with bags over their head. They've stripped them down, they've tied them up, they have manacles on them, and it was very dehumanizing. And these were just typical college students. And again, people were really shocked what happened. And ultimately the study was stopped early. It didn't go for the 2 weeks that it was planned to go for, because the conditions were just getting so horrific there. And when word of all these different things came out, there was again an outrage. And so the National Research Act of 1974 was signed in a reaction to this research. It was, and then part of that report was the commissioning of the Belmont Report in 1979. And the Belmont Report said there are 3 basic ethical principles that we've already been introduced to when we talked about the Nuremberg Accords. Respect for persons. So acknowledge the autonomy of other people, and that needs to always guide your research. Am I respecting the autonomy of my research participants? And in particular, protect those with diminished autonomy. And that became a very important thing coming out of the Belmont Report, as you would guess, with the Willowbrook studies, where we're having kids who really are very vulnerable, that were treated to horrific, being given a disease. Beneficence, doing no harm, that the goal of the research should be to advance humankind, help people, so do no harm, and maximize the benefits to the participants, that this became an important criteria standard by which we judge research. And then justice, that there's an equitable distribution of the benefits. And actually right now, in my discipline, there's a lot of debate going on about justice, that we go into these communities and we study those communities and we get publications out of this research, which result in us getting promotion and raises and so forth. And what are we really giving back to the community? And this relates around this issue of justice. And so there always should be, if I'm using these people for my research, I need to make sure that they benefit from this research as well. And that's one of the guiding principles. But, we saw that this happened already. These principles were reiterated in the Nuremberg Accords. They'd already been talked about when, people were just reflecting on what was ethical research. And yet we continued to see violations. And what the National Research Act, and more critically, the Belmont Report did, which I think is foundational for the addressing of research ethics in scientific research, is they created the Ethical or Institutional Review Board. So ERBs or IRBs were created. So at the local level, we had more engagement in discussion and consideration of ethical concerns, that they weren't these global principles, that we needed to bring it to the local level. And with this, we begin to see more ethically sound research. Are there still ethical violations in research? Certainly. But I think that this was the critical watershed point in making scientific research more ethical, was the creation of the ERBs and the IRBs. And so they're a critical part of this process. ERBs, I think you're familiar with them to a certain extent. I just want to talk quickly. They were created in Kenya, as I understand it, as part of the National Commission for Science, Technology, and Innovation. And they do a cost-benefit analysis. We're doing the same thing we've done for literally centuries when looking at science. Is the benefit from the research outweigh the potential costs, and what can we do to minimize those costs? Oftentimes these can be institutional ERBs, so they could be like the one at Daystar. We have several here at Michigan State University. Some places the model is more private. There are countries in Europe where the ERBs tend to be private companies that you go to make sure that your research is acceptable, or they can be run by the government. And the reason, for example, in some European countries they have the private one is now many of your top journals will make you indicate that your research has been approved by an ethical review board. That's critical before we're willing to publish this, because when unethical research is published, it doesn't only discredit the researchers, it also discredits the journal as well as the entire scientific process. And so that's why we see in some places private ERBs, and so that everyone can get approval. And the implications for researchers is that it gives you oversight. It helps you think about these things. And then another critical thing is adverse event monitoring. Now, I've been doing research for close to 40 years. I hate to admit that, but never thought that I've done research that was unethical or was likely to have adverse effects on participants. But it happens. And twice in my career, I've had participants, both of them very minor, but having the ERB there to help with monitoring what's going on with the participants is a critical thing that's very important that ERBs provide. Issues that ERBs are going to look at is knowledge gain versus potential impact. And part of this, and this gets controversial in the United States, is a lot of IRBs in the United States say, well, if we're looking at knowledge gains, that means this needs to be good research. So not only will they look at the ethics of the research, but they'll look at the quality of the research, and they'll come back and say, well, maybe you should do this as opposed to that, which always makes researchers angry when you're saying, oh, I wasn't doing it perfectly to begin with. But you are weighing how much knowledge is gained versus the potential impact. And if this is shoddy research, there's not likely to be knowledge gains. And so that becomes an issue. Another thing is the types of risks that are being dealt with. So physical, psychological, social, and economic risks. These are all risks that you may put your participants at in your research. And you need to look at both short-term and long-term risk. And a lot of times I've known people who have, I have a colleague who, I don't want to call him a colleague. I have a person in my college who has done research that I consider to be very unethical. And a big part of it is that this particular individual did not consider the long-term effects on his research participants. And we'll come back to this case in a few minutes. And then they're going to categorize what's the level of risk involved in this research. So is it minimal risk versus very high risk? And then go back and do that cost benefit analysis to say, is this acceptable or not? What can be put in place to make this more acceptable, and so forth. And so these are the types of things that ERBs are going to be doing for you. But to me, this is the critical part. Why does this matter? Because, as a scientist who needs to get publications and to get promotion, to get raises and things like this, it's easy to see the ERBs and IRBs as a barrier to doing your research. And I would argue, no, that's not the case. And I was particularly impressed looking at the time frame for getting ERB approval at Daystar University. We're about the same here at Michigan State, but Ohio State University, when I was there, it would typically take us 3 to 4 months to get IRB approval. It was just a very slow process, and you built that into your time. And so when we wanted to do a study in the fall, we would submit the IRB application in February or March so that we would have it through the process by September. And my postdoc at Vanderbilt University, actually there, 6 months was considered fast, and it wasn't uncommon for it to be in the process for up to a year. And when that's the case, it seems like, oh my gosh, this is doing nothing but slowing down my research. And obviously universities try to work to make it faster than that. And you should consider yourself fortunate at Daystar, given the times that average turnaround is compared to some of the places I've been at. But it's easy to see this as, why do I have to do with this paperwork? Because it can be a lot of forms and I have to wait until they give me approval. And I just want to do my research. But it matters a lot. It really does matter a lot. First of all, for your protection. Again, I've been doing research for close to 40 years, not quite 40 years. And they will raise issues, the ERBs will raise issues that you have not considered. That has happened with me on several occasions, where they would come back and say, well, you're using deception in this study. And it's like, what are you talking about? What do you mean I'm using deception? And they're like, well, you're giving the students a lot of materials at the beginning of this experiment, and you're not telling them you're going to be testing their memory later on. And that could be particularly stressful for the students. Are there things we can do to try to minimize that stress? And I was like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And in fact, there were things we could do to minimize the stress, and it made it a better study. And so there are times when the ERB criticisms or comments, questions back to you will actually improve the quality of the research. Also, it gives you legal and ethical protection. When you can say, yes, I went through the ERB and they gave me approval, none of us foresee this as something that could have happened. You have that protection because you went through that process. But I think even more important, if you're here sitting through this today, research is important to you. This is what you're about. And do you want to be a part of that conversation? If my partner Nancy were to lie to Sister Landau, would Sister Landau still be, we talk with her all the time, would that still be going on? No. When people are unethical to you in conversations, you don't converse with them anymore. And the same thing happens in the scientific enterprise, where you will be ostracized if you engage in unethical research. I mentioned recently there's an individual in my college who did some research that many of us consider very unethical. It got through the IRB at Michigan State University for some strange reason, but essentially he's been ostracized. None of us will talk with him about research anymore because he has been tainted by what was a pretty horrific study that he did. I have the initials UAB there. UAB is a University of Alabama at Birmingham, which is a top medical school in the southern part of the United States. And there, IRB or ethical problems were happening at such an extent that the federal government stepped in and shut down research at UAB for a while until things could be cleaned up. The vast majority of researchers were not unethical, though. There was just a handful that were, and it was getting through the IRB through various reasons, oftentimes because they were lying about what their protocols were. So they were intentionally deceiving the IRB. But you can imagine that when an entire university is shut down, does anybody have anything to do with those researchers who are responsible for that, for those unethical people who resulted in all research being stopped unless it was critical research for the health of patients in the hospital? All research was stopped. No, most of them were fired and no longer could be involved in the academy and no longer could be researchers because they were colored as they should have been as unethical. But that means when that happens, you are no longer a part of the conversation. As someone who has been to Africa, talked with young scholars, talked with graduate students about their research ideas, I need you to be a part of that conversation. When I was sitting there at Daystar talking with students about their ideas, these ideas were so exciting and so innovative and coming at ideas from different perspectives that I just walked away in awe. And I need you to be a part of the conversation. And to be a part of the conversation, you need to be ethical in your research and you need to follow these procedures. Also, if you want to combat unethical practices, you need to be following the ethical practices. There are a lot of experiences of scholars from the global north coming down to the global south and doing unethical research. So Dr. Richard McGowan in Zimbabwe was an anesthesiologist, I believe, from Scotland, and did very unethical things. And ultimately, he was tried. He only served a year in prison, and given the things that he did, in my mind, it should have been a much more stricter, much more harsh punishment. Or the Pfizer doing the trofaxalacin trials during a meningitis outbreak in Nigeria in 1996. Again, without consent, very unethical research. And recently, as I understand it, it's happened there in Nairobi, where scholars from the University of Maryland and UC Berkeley were looking at how to enforce payments for water and sanitation services in very poor parts of Nairobi. And a lot of people argued that they were putting very undue stress on the people in the community. In other words, what we're talking about is the practice is called ethics dumping. And ethics dumping is when you have scholars from the global north who have research they can't do there because it's deemed unethical, come to the global south and do the research. And that is a horrific, awful practice. And if you want to speak out against that, you need to be following the ethical guidelines so you have a foot to stand on. So you can say, I can do this, you need to do this. And if you want to stop ethics dumping, which I think we all do, you need to be following this procedure so you have the moral high ground. And the final thing that I want to mention with this is trust in science. And this, we oftentimes can think, well, this unethical research, yeah, it does decrease people's trust in scientists and it does color how people view scientists, but that's not really a big deal. In the United States, for example, some people who don't trust science think that the world is flat, and, big deal. So we have some people who are ignorant, who think the earth is flat. What's the big deal? But when you undermine public trust in science, you're undermining the entire process. As the VC was talking about earlier, funding for science is dependent upon oftentimes governments. And if you undermine the trust in science, you're undermining the support that is given to the scientific enterprise. In the United States, what we are finding right now is that one of the biggest contributors, specifically for Black people, one of the biggest contributors to them not getting vaccinated against COVID is distrust of science. They do not trust science, and so they're not going to get vaccinated. And Nancy's data support that's the case. It was enough of an issue that Howard University had a special panel looking at Tuskegee, because a lot of people were tracing it back to that. If you're a Black person in the United States and you know about Tuskegee and the horrible things that were done there, yeah, it's going to undermine your faith in the scientific enterprise. And so not only did that unethical research result in the premature death of probably more than 100 men who were involved in the study, that negative effect is continuing because you have undermined the faith in science so that people today are dying because they won't get vaccinated because they don't trust science. And oftentimes these individuals are convincing other people not to get vaccinated. And so we're not just talking about coloring your perception, we're talking about life and death effects that can happen because of unethical research. If you believe in science, and I believe you do because you're here and want to be a researcher, then you're obligated to follow these ethical practices to protect the endeavor that you love. And that's the bottom line, okay? So I close with God ethics, and I would love to talk longer and longer. Sister has dealt with me before. She knows how long I can talk. There are lots of other issues that we could have talked about. What are the implications of your research for larger issues, for the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project? Many of them, before the nuclear bomb was dropped, and then after the nuclear bomb was dropped, came out and spoke against the ethics of their research because of what had happened. And sometimes you need to think about and then speak out against larger things that happen from your research. I have had this situation happen with my research, where research I did early in my career ended up being used in an instrument that can implicitly measure people's attitudes. And it's used in unethical ways by businesses. And I've had to deal with, I didn't foresee that consequence of my research. Would I have still done the research? Yeah. Would I have done it differently? Certainly. And would I have done more to fight this consequence had I thought about it before? Yeah. And we fought against it since then. But these are things you have to think about. And then there's the whole issue of, like data fabrication, doing inappropriate data analysis, plagiarism of research. All of these are ethical issues, and all of these undermine the scientific process because they undermine people's faith in the scientific endeavor. And ultimately, science is dependent upon people having faith in what we do. Thank you very much. I look forward to when I can return to Daystar, hopefully within the year, because I dearly love it there and I love talking with people about research there. But thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Can we appreciate the keynote speaker again? I know he's far, but he can hear. I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Watson for that very clear, precise, and very excellent presentations that he has made this afternoon. And just before I invite the VC to be able to appreciate the keynote speaker, I want to open up the floor for some interactions. Both those of us who are physically here, if you have a question that you would like to raise, we are going to give you an opportunity to do so. We'll also look at questions that have been fielded by our online participants. Again, we shall be able to respond. So I want to begin by asking those of us who are here, if you have any questions, please, to the keynote speaker this afternoon. If there are any questions that you would like to raise, this is the opportunity for you to do so. Okay. Looks like people are still, there is a mic that is going around. It's also going to be sanitized. And those of you who may require it, I think yes, I can see one. Thank you. You need to use the mic so that you can be able to be captured, yes. Yes, you have the floor.
Is it me who I'm supposed to start my comment?
Oh, sorry. I was seeing this side and this side. Please, have the floor.
I think I like the presentation. He has actually given a very good presentation, especially the angle that when we do our work very well as an ethics review committee, as IRBs, would actually bring a lot of integrity on the research, and probably this misconception that people even don't trust research being done on even the vaccination of COVID and so forth. That comes from people mistrusting the research work that is being done. I think I really appreciate his presentation.
Thank you. That's a comment. Just your name and your institution, please.
Liso from Pan University.
Liso?
Liso from Pan University.
Okay, Pan University, thank you. I think next we had a question there.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. Dr. Moretti from Desa University. Two questions. First, I appreciate the presentation. It is really enlightening because some of the things you talked about and ethical practices are things that I've never heard. And we didn't know the root of all these, what you can call them the evil practices that led to the ethical practice in the world. So the two questions. The first question is there a study without an ethical practice? Both physical, psychological, mental, is there a study without
Excuse me,
ethical practice?
just a minute. I'm told that our keynote address cannot hear. I don't know whether it's, maybe you come and pose your question here in the front so that you can be able to get it. So maybe you get to the podium. If there is any other question that you want to raise, please immediately he leaves the podium. Let's take about 3 questions, then we can be able to give the keynote address an opportunity to be able to respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was saying that I really appreciate the presentation from the keynote speaker, and he has really enlightened us in a lot of areas, issues to do with ethical practices, over the history, and he has given us the root of some of those very evil practices, from the issues to do with vaccination, syphilis, and all those Second World War and all that. However, I have two questions. The first question is there a study without an ethical practice? Is there a study without an ethical practice? And if so, how can we prove that? The second question is, what's the relationship between science ethical principles and biblical ethical principles? What's the relationship between science ethical principles and biblical principles, ethical principles? Thank you.
These are very, very good questions. And this is why I love visiting, because my mind has always expanded through these brilliant questions and observations and research ideas in that.
Dave, we can't hear you. Put on your mic.
Okay, Leah Komen is my name. I have a question to you, Professor Watson. And my question is in regard to indigenous communities. I'm talking about the communities in Australia, Canada, and Africa, parts of Africa. And I'm wondering whether, when it comes to ethics, there is a special consideration for such groups, particularly given that their social structure is somewhat different. They have, to other communities, I think in Australia, they have their own IREC of some sort for the indigenous. What do you have to say about the indigenous communities and ethics? Thank you.
Can you hear me now? I'm not sure why my mic isn't seeming to be working.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Excellent questions. You want me to go ahead and answer those two, or should I? This is part of the reason I miss being in Africa and being at VESAR, because my experience always there is the questions and the ideas just expand the way I think about things. And so those are excellent and extremely difficult questions. Is any scientific study ethical? Purely ethical? And I would say no, there are probably always limitations in any scientific study. I can think about from my own perspective. We don't tell people up front, this is exactly what we're interested in studying, because if we say what we're interested in studying is the effect of video games on violence, then they're going to react to that. And so there is always information that we keep away from them. And then we'll give it to them usually at the end of it. And that's why it's always a balancing act. What is it that we're learning versus what are the potential risks to the participants? And there are always potential risks. And so we want to do what we can to balance that so that we're maximizing the benefits of the study, which is why, for example, at Ohio State, their IRB really took it as a position that we will criticize the research to try to improve it, because we want to maximize the quality of the research. And what can we do to minimize any risk to the participants? And that's, for example, why we do the monitoring afterwards. And so particularly if there is risk. So for example, if we did a study on video game violence and we thought there might be, behavior exhibited by one of the participants that suggests there might be a risk, then we're going to monitor that person for quite a while. So no, I don't think there's any research that is without those risks. And again, it's always an issue of weighing those risks. And that's why I think the IRB and the ERBs are such a critically important part of this process. And I understand that they can be a pain, but they are a critical part of this process. In terms of indigenous populations, I think there are two very critical points with indigenous populations. First of all, is because of different cultural practices, It's one of those things where we need to be very careful to make sure that consent is understood and that there is a higher bar that needs to happen. But even more, and this is the big part of the debate that's going on in the United States with indigenous populations, and part of it focuses on Australia and New Zealand, but a lot of it focuses on the indigenous populations here in the United States, where we go in and we do research and we do absolutely nothing for the community. And it's that obligation that we need to make sure that the community is learning from what we are doing. And so when we go into indigenous communities and we study various issues, it's not enough for us to thank them and tell them what our study is about. We have an obligation to take our results back to the community and engage in programs to improve the community. And I think that is a critical thing with indigenous populations, because the history of the world is that the global north tends to exploit indigenous populations quite horrifically. And part of this process, I think, is that special obligation, that third thing that came out of the report saying, justice, that we need to give back to the community. And I think that's a critical part of it. I hope that answers your question. Is there another question or?
Let me know if there is any other person who would like to ask questions so that we move together. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Watson, for your presentation. That was very insightful. My question is to look at what informs ethical practices. Are we getting our perceptions from Western-oriented thoughts of ethics? So the question is, what is the converging points between the view of the North and the South perspective of ethics? Do we have convergence, or do we see differences in terms of how we approach ethics? Of course, with the understanding that we are coming from different contexts, and so we have to be aware of different variations of research in our context. Dr. Lydia Radoli, Daystar University.
Thank you for that excellent question. Like I said, every time I'm there, I get asked questions that I'm going to be thinking about for 6 months. And this is one of those questions that is outstanding. And this goes back to the question with the indigenous population, when we're doing studies with indigenous populations as well. I would hope that there's convergence. I would hope that there's appreciation for distinct ethical criteria, that we work together for those. Because I think in a lot of ways we see common principles underlying the differences, that there will be common principles that underlie the ethical principles. And so I would hope that there would be convergence. And part of the reason I would hope that there's convergence is because of the arrogance of the global North, to be quite frank, that we always think we have the solution. And that if we take a convergence attitude, we're going to learn, which is what's supposed to be the scientific attitude, but we don't tend to do that. The scientific attitude, the way I've always taught it, the way I teach it to my students, is that you take everybody's viewpoints and improve your ideas by wrestling through those, such as this question is going to certainly improve me, because I'm going to go out and do some reading about this and think about it more, because I'm not giving as good of an answer as I should. I don't know as much about this as I should. And so thank you for challenging me that way. But I would hope that when we're coming together from the global North and the global South, that there is a mutual respect and a convergence, so that we're learning from each other. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Very nice presentation. My name is Ed. Okay.
I was going to say, it wasn't me.
So my name is Edwin Were from Moi University. My question is, Thank you very much for bringing in the issue of ethics dumping. And my question is around the foundational principles around considerations for research ethics, the Belmont principles. Do you feel that in the current day and age, where there's a lot of collaborative research, the Belmont principles are adequate for consideration on research that is done in circumstances that are so radically different, like from the West and, or if you like, the North and the South? And I'm particularly interested in issues of social value, post-research benefits, and the issue of consenting. How do we use those initial foundational principles to bring them into the setting of collaborative research where there is so much differences in culture, in resources, in so many other things? Thank you.
Again, an excellent, excellent question. I think it can work, but it's a difficult process. What we do right now in research that I'm doing with colleagues at other universities within the United States is that each university, ERB or IRB, has to sign off on the research. And at times that is a pain. I mean, believe me, it's a pain. I have a research that's going on with a colleague out in Colorado right now. And my IRB was very focused on different issues than his IRB. But by going through both of those, I believe the research is more ethical. It's better research, both in terms of the quality of the research and the ethics of the research. And those are intricately intertwined. And I think the same thing has to happen when we're doing research that involves scholars from the global North and the global South, that the IRBs and the ERBs from each context need to be a critical part of that process, that we don't do the research until the IRBs or ERBs in the global North and the IRBs and the ERBs in the global South all sign off and say, this is ethical research. Because my experience, and I know from both myself and from other colleagues who have had to go through going through IRBs at other universities, it is difficult. It is a pain. It can slow down the process. But my experience is every time that has happened, not only does it make my research more ethical, it makes my research more sound. It makes my research better because it makes me consider issues that I've not considered before. But thank you for bringing it up. But that would be my approach. I think it has to be an issue of mutual respect. It can't be an issue of colonialism where the global North thinks we have the right to dictate what is ethical or unethical in Kenya. That's wrong, and that should never be the case. And so I think both sides need to be weighing. I mean, everybody involved, not sides, everybody involved needs to be weighing in. But thank you.
Two more questions, the last one's for you, and then we'll be able to end up that. There was a question that was asked earlier on, maybe you didn't get it, but somebody was asking what is the relationship between science ethical principles and biblical ethical principles? I think that was an earlier question that was put to you, Dr. Walson. And the last one is that there is one coming online. It says, I am involved in an ethical review committee in a university in Kenya. The real challenge I face is to do with what exactly IRB should look for. Is it only ethical considerations or also language, formatting, and adherence to research principles? That is coming from David Ndegwa, a researcher fellow at Boston College. He's given his contact as that, but he was working previously in JOOST. So those are the two questions that we'd like you to respond to, and then we'll be able to conclude this session. Thank you.
The first question is one that I would like to have like 3 weeks to prepare my answer for. That's a very difficult question, and I'm not sure I'm the individual to answer it, at least right now, and I apologize for that. There are relationships, I believe, across the ethical systems. There are fundamental values that have to guide across the ethical systems, and that, the respect for, and a lot of those will go back to, I'm gonna quote Dr. King, the respect for the inherent interdependence of all people. I think that's got to be the underlying principle, and I see that as underlying a lot of ethical systems. I'm sorry, I can't give a better answer than that. I would need more time to think, and you can get my email from Sister Landauer. It's ewolson@msu.edu, and I would be thrilled to extend this discussion, because I have a feeling I can learn a lot from you in this discussion, and so I would love it if you would email me about that. With regard to the second question, that it's a very tough one. What do I think versus what people do? Because I've been frustrated when I've had IRBs come back and say, well, have you thought about this in your study, or have you thought about this? Because I want to say, your job is only to consider the ethics of it. And I know as a researcher, it gets annoying. And one of the risks is then that researchers get annoyed and don't go through IRB, which is one of the worst things we want to have happen. But I think IRBs do have some obligation if we're looking at benefits versus harms. The benefit of the research is improved if the quality of the research is improved. And so I wouldn't, I think you have to balance it. I wouldn't micromanage. I wouldn't say, well, use this scale as opposed to this scale, but I would say, there are some issues here with the design of this that raise questions for us. And the reason we think this is important is that if we're doing a risk-benefit analysis, this is going to maximize the benefit we get from your research if the quality of the research is improved. And I think IRBs need to be careful about framing it that way. Because the reaction I always hear my colleagues say is, well, why are they doing that? That's not part of their purview. They're only supposed to be looking at the ethics of the research. And when you come back and say, no, part of the ethics of the research is improving the value of the research, because that's part of the equation, then I think it's better received on the part of the researchers. And again, I hope that answers your question. I know on that one in particular, there are a lot of people who disagree with me and think the only thing that they should be weighing in as the ethics of the research. But I think they're part of that does in fact involve, if you see really fatal flaws with a study, then I think that does involve an obligation to say, this appears problematic to us.
Thank you very much. In the Kenyan culture, we appreciate people, and we want to appreciate you. I don't know how we're going to do that, but I'm going to ask the Vice Chancellor to come and appreciate you and give you a gift virtually as well.
I was going to say, I already have a hat from the Vice Chancellor, which I love.
David, thank you so much for ably talking to us about the research process and ethics. I found the question on religion very interesting, because I've always been guided by the principle that ethics is about morals. Essentially, it's about morals, it's about character. And I keep asking people, whichever religion, whether you are a Christian, a Muslim, a Hindu, or an indigenous religion, it always asks of us of these virtues: honesty, integrity, openness, transparency, accountability, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, the whole idea of ethics is a soft area. You know, and we are trying to kind of soften the research by ensuring that we protect our respondents, the human subjects, and even the animals. And that is godliness, if you asked me. So we'll be carrying on that conversation. But just know that I want my audience to know that ethics sits in the realm of morals. Yeah, and morals align themselves to our different spiritual beliefs.
Mhm.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
really that's what urges me not to plagiarize, urges me to do the right thing when I'm carrying out a study. And even constrains me not to be cruel to animals. That's an inner standing, an inner calling. So I think, yeah, we can carry on the conversation moving forward. And that's why somebody was asking, what are the beacons? What are the parameters for IRB members in judging work submitted to them for review? Because it is some indicators are very hard to measure. Do I really want to clear a document where I'm seeing obvious gaps in knowledge construction around a certain concept? And all these things come up. So thank you very much. We appreciate, and I want to thank you once again for hosting me in Michigan and all those walks we had together on campus and the jokes and you know, everything else. So thank you very much. Now, I have a bag here and I'm going to use it as a bait so that you come to get it when you come. So I'll not DHL it, but I will keep it safely in my office. This will be the first gift you'll get. Let's clap for David. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you so much. And it was an honor to have you here, and it's great to meet you and to get to know you better. Thank you.
Yeah, just before I make the last announcement for us to go for lunch, I want to take this opportunity again to appreciate Professor Airo and Professor Walter Oyawa for the keynote addresses they made this morning. I know we didn't have an opportunity to field questions, but I want to encourage you to write questions. Use the Q&A functions. We shall be able to respond as far as possible to the questions that you may have. And even those of you who may still have some questions regarding the presentation that has been made by our keynote speaker, Walton, again, you please just fill them. I'm sure he will be able to have access to that, and he can also be able to respond. One question that I want to respond to as I close is one that was asked by someone. I can't remember exactly who, but it was fielded on the chat. He was asking, or the person was asking, what is the role of ethics review committee in matters that relate to export of materials, biological materials? And this is what I want to say about it. That the institutional ethics review committees, you have a great responsibility in terms of safeguarding the materials that are going to be exported between point A, which could probably be in this country, to point B. And how does that happen? It happens because when you are reviewing those proposals, one may indicate within the proposal that there's going to have their materials either analyzed or stored, and those materials will be moving from point A to point B. Then once that is done, you see that, the next phase is for you to ask whether there is a material transfer agreement. And you as a committee, you have the responsibility of examining those material transfer agreements before they come to NACOSTI for clearance. And as NACOSTI, we have given guidelines on material transfer, which will assist you to look at, to review those documents. And one of the things that we expect you at least to look at, there are issues of why are those materials going to be transferred. Many times we see the issue of perhaps you do not have facilities in the country and therefore you want to have them analyzed at point B, or sometimes it's about collaborative studies, and there was an agreement within yourselves that part of this study will be done here and part of that study will be there. And of course, we may need to see whether that evidence is actually there. So as a committee, I think you have that great responsibility to scrutinize them and see the validity or the reasons that are being given why those materials are being transferred. Issues of IP, again, you need to look at it. What happens when those materials are transferred to point B, and if there are going to be any issues of IP, who owns it? You also need to look at what is the community going to benefit and so on and so forth. So in a nutshell, I just wanted to reinforce and say that as committees, I think you have a greater responsibility. Just before those documents come to NACOSTI, you need to have reviewed them so that even as we look at them from NACOSTI's point of view, then we are giving it a second eye. Having said that, we now are going to break for lunch. Lunch is going to be served to where you took your tea. So just go to the place you took your tea, and that is where you're going to find lunch. We're going to give you 30 minutes, then we assemble here. It's now, I think, 2:30 or something, but we are assembling here at 3 o'clock. So please, let's be back here at 3 o'clock. Those of you who are online, we want to encourage you again, and we want to thank you for staying tuned. That we'll be here exactly at 3 o'clock. You can also have your lunch. I wish we would be able to give you lunch by through online, but please, let's meet here at 3. Thank you very much. And perhaps we can pray for that lunch as we leave. So let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we are grateful this afternoon, this far that you have come. We thank you for being there for us, and we thank you for every blessing that you brought in our way. Thank you, Lord, even for the gift of lunch. Lord, we receive it with thanksgiving. We ask you that you may bless us even as we go to partake of it in Jesus' name. Amen.